The Curse of the Black Death, written and read by Christopher Halton. During the early 1900s, I was engaged as a civil engineer to lay down a new railway extension near the village of Black Wharton in Lancashire. The work involved cutting through several hillocks, excavating deep cuttings, particularly near two towns, and constructing bridges over rivers and viaducts over roads. The line encompassed a distance of 18 miles and was designed to afford a relatively level track without the necessity of introducing uphill gradients to overcome geographical obstacles. The soil was largely heavy clay, which, though difficult to cut, proved more forgiving than in other parts of the county where stone had to be blasted. To accomplish this monumental task, we employed navvies, that is, labourers drawn from every region of Britain and Ireland. Workers who were away from home for many months often brought their families with them. Consequently, land was set aside for temporary camps where tents served as accommodation as the work slowly progressed along the route. Unfortunately, as with all engineering projects of this scale, there were casualties. Landslides were common, and flooding occurred where the water table lay high and natural aquifers were disturbed. On occasion, these burst through the railway banks, burying men before they could escape. In spite of every precaution known to science, we were losing roughly 2 workers for every mile dug, and sometimes more when confronted with large hills that demanded tunnelling. The project's owners, the Mid-Southern Railway Company, were unmoved by such losses. Their sole concern was that the line be completed on time, thereby securing greater profits for their shareholders. Despite these deaths, the project continued to advance on schedule, with only 6 miles remaining. That was to change when we arrived near Black Wharton. Before I continue, some history must be shared. The village bore its name from the Black Death of 1348, which ravaged the settlement and all but erased it from the map, killing nearly all who lived there. In such afflicted areas, the dead were thrown into pits hastily excavated by the living and buried after little more than a brief ritual and prayer. In time, the locations of these graves were lost to history, and Black Wharton was no exception. The villagers were, by and large, deeply unhappy that their rural peace was to be disturbed by the railway works, and particularly so when it was revealed that the track would skim the very edge of the cemetery beside the local church, a fine building of imported French limestone erected in the 11th century. It is here that my story and the tragedies that followed truly begin. Owing to the extraordinary mortality of the plague, more than 300 souls were known to have been buried in a single pit. The priest, said to be the last to die, was reputed to have cursed any who disturbed the dead, having witnessed the pain, misery, and suffering of his flock as they perished one by one. He demanded that they be left in eternal peace. None of this, of course, was known at the time, and had it been, it would doubtless have been dismissed by the directors of the railway company, who understood only that delay meant expense, and expense was an enemy to profit. On a late September afternoon, I was summoned by supervisors overseeing the levelling of a mound. They reported that some of the navvies had begun a ghoulish game of football using human skulls, while others were digging through what they believed to be an ossuary, searching for rings, brooches, and other valuables in what had become a grotesque treasure hunt. Horrified, I went at once to the site. There I found a great heap of human remains carelessly cast aside along the intended line of the railway. Some of the workers' wives had joined their husbands and were proudly wearing jewellery that appeared to be medieval in origin, while the men were locked in a scrum, shoving one another aside to reach the exposed bones. I immediately ordered the work to cease and attempted to prevent the women from fleeing with the jewellery, which had plainly come from the ossuary, though in this I was unsuccessful. Instructing the foreman to drive the men back with sticks, I eventually restored a semblance of order, particularly when the threat of dismissal was made clear. It was beyond doubt that we had uncovered the plague pit. In this instance, not a hollow, but a mound beneath which the bodies had been buried in thick layers of earth. In fulfilment of my legal obligations, I reported the discovery to the police, who immediately ordered a complete cessation of work until the remains could be examined by the local coroner. It was concluded that the bones were indeed medieval, after which the site was inspected by archaeologists. The remains were collected in vans and transported to a newly opened grave pit within the church cemetery, where they were laid to rest. Any jewellery recovered during this process or seized by the police from the navvies' wives was handed over to the county museum. The institution agreed to pay a finder's fee for each item returned, though it may be safely assumed that the number of such returns was minimal. After 3 weeks, permission was granted for work on the railway line to resume. From that moment onward, however, the project became beset by an unrelenting succession of accidents and delays. These cost the company dearly in financial losses and were accompanied by a steadily rising number of deaths, attributed variously to mishap and apparent natural causes. So grave did the situation become that the company was forced to seek additional investment from the banks, while replacement workers grew increasingly difficult to procure. Despite this, many of the new men seemed at first largely unaffected. Nevertheless, the line soon earned a grim reputation and became known locally as the Railway of Death. It drew unwelcome attention from both the local and national press, who by then had uncovered reports of the curse pronounced by the long-dead priest. Though the site was blessed following the intervention of the local bishop, the deaths of workers and, disturbingly, of their wives continued without abatement. It was by the narrowest of margins that the line was eventually completed a few months later. When the figures were finally calculated, it was found that 12 men had died for every mile constructed. This was all the more troubling given that this stretch of the railway was, by any engineering measure, relatively straightforward, presenting no natural hazards sufficient to explain such losses. When the line was eventually opened to traffic, a ceremony was conducted by the railway company's managing director, Sir Basil Langthorne, in the presence of a brass band, local dignitaries, and a large crowd drawn from the surrounding district. It was a notably jolly occasion, and for a brief while the grim memories of the recent past seemed to fade, as the band struck up a lively tune, and Sir Basil stepped forward to cut the tape. As he did so, he faltered, swayed on his feet, and then suddenly collapsed. He was pronounced dead at the scene, the cause suspected to be a heart attack. The expression of fear and horror upon the faces of those assembled was unmistakable, and a dreadful uncertainty passed through the crowd as to who might be next. The opening ceremony was abruptly ended. Sir Basil's body was removed by an undertaker after the local doctor confirmed his death, and the crowd dispersed in stunned silence. As for myself, being the man who had overseen the entire project from its inception, I could not help but feel that my own death was now only a matter of time. Sir Basil's demise renewed a frenzy within the press. Soon afterwards, journalists began gathering accounts of worker deaths from every district from which the men had originally been drawn. With more than a little poetic license, they claimed the toll had risen to nearly 200. I could not verify their figures, yet the reports troubled me sufficiently that I resolved to examine the matter more closely. Accordingly, on a cold afternoon in February, I travelled to Black Wharton and called upon the village vicar, the Reverend Alan Forrester. He welcomed me warmly into his home, a comfortable late Victorian residence situated near the church of St. Frida. I explained the purpose of my visit and my connection to the nearby railway works. While seated in his sitting room as his wife Emma prepared tea and crumpets, I inquired about the legend surrounding the long-dead priest and the devastation wrought by the Black Death in Black Wharton. Forrester, a man in his early 60s of average build with thinning grey hair cropped short, replied quietly, "There is a record of it within the church itself. In fact, it is carved rather crudely upon the wall of the bell tower. It lists the deaths and it records a curse upon those who disturb the dead." He paused, then rose and returned with several sheets of typewritten notes. "These are translations of the graffiti inside the tower. They were compiled some years ago by a visiting professor. You are welcome to borrow them should you wish." I placed the papers into my leather attaché case and asked, "Are you aware of the succession of unusual deaths that followed the disturbance of the plague graves?" He looked at me mournfully. "Yes, I am. Regrettably, 2 of my parishioners were employed on that line. One was struck and killed when a horse reared without warning while he was cleaning a stable. The other was crushed beneath a tree brought down during a storm. As a man of God, I cannot accept that a curse has been invoked. That is sheer nonsense. But the rate of death is deeply troubling, to say the least." He then handed me the keys to the locked church and invited me to wander inside at my leisure. As he was due to depart within the hour, he asked that I return the keys through the letterbox when I was finished. After a pleasant conversation over tea and crumpets, I took my leave of them both and stepped back out into the cold. I soon discovered among the keys he had given me a large and ornate iron one that slid neatly into a gargoyle-shaped escutcheon, its open mouth serving as the keyhole. With firm pressure the key turned, and the tongue withdrew into the lock with a loud, ominous thud. The door then creaked slowly open as though an unseen hand were urging me inside. I felt expected. Upon entering, I placed my hat and coat upon a hanger, and removing the notes from my attaché case, made my way toward the bell tower. There, plainly visible upon the stonework, were the carvings themselves. They depicted scenes not mentioned in the written descriptions. A horned demonic figure dragging chains of human forms toward the gaping maw of a far larger creature, which I could only assume represented hell itself. When it came to hellish depictions, the medieval mind was in a league of its own. I also noticed a large oak settle with a high back placed against the tower wall. I assumed it had been positioned there for the relief of weary bell ringers, and I seated myself upon it briefly before a thought occurred to me. Was there anything carved in relief behind it? As I had the entire building to myself, I cautiously dragged the settle away from the wall, an effort that required considerable exertion. Judging by the pale grey of the exposed stone, it seemed clear that the bench had not been moved for many years. Revealed behind it was a low stone doorway, with steps descending to a second locked door, thickly veiled in dust and cobwebs. I tried several of the keys provided, and at length found a smaller ancient one that fit the lock. Even then it stubbornly resisted, and it took several minutes of careful manipulation to persuade it to turn. I confess that I resorted to using oil from a hanging lamp to lubricate the mechanism before the bolt finally gave way. Beyond lay a chamber of darkness. Raising the lamp, I peered inside. It proved to be an undercroft dating from around the time of the church's original construction, supported by freestanding stone pillars that buttressed the floor above. The air was dank, and the floor lay thick with damp dust and the brittle remains of insects that had crawled in and died. The atmosphere was one of heavy foreboding, of gloom and utter despondency. I observed that the chamber contained several stone sarcophagi, their lids carved with the likenesses of those interred within. All were medieval in character. Many bore the effigies of Templar knights, lying prostrate with crossed legs and the Lion of Judah carved at their feet, while one displayed the unmistakable form of a monk, or perhaps a priest. I moved cautiously about the chamber and soon realized that my footprints were the first to disturb the dust in many years. I was beyond doubt the first living soul to set foot in that place for centuries. The walls were fitted with iron wall braziers once used for medieval lighting, and apart from all else, I noticed a solitary iron-banded oak coffer of immense age. The lock and its fittings, weakened by centuries of corrosion, gave way at the slightest touch, collapsing into fragments as the surrounding wood crumbled into dust. Within, something caught the light and gleamed. There were solid silver offertory plates, beautifully engraved in floral relief with biblical scenes, and a crucifix at their centre. A large crucifix of solid gold, and a gold pomander casket which still exhaled the faintest trace of ambergris. In all, it was a considerable fortune of what is known as church plate. Gold chalices, patens, ciboria, flagons and reliquaries, all gathered together. I concluded that these treasures had been concealed here for safekeeping during the ravages of the Black Death. I stood for some moments utterly dumbstruck by my discovery. Then greed overtook reason. I resolved to remove the hoard and profit from its sale. It seemed to me that the church would scarcely miss what it did not know it possessed, and those to whom it had once belonged were long since dead. I left the chamber and returned to the body of the church, where, in the vestry, I found a stout cloth bag large enough to carry my haul. I hastened back to the undercroft, unwilling to linger longer than was necessary, filled the bag with as much as I could bear, and then quit the chamber. As I emerged into the light, I was seized by horror. Before me stood 3 Templar knights clad in chainmail and wearing white surplices marked with red crucifixes. Each carried a sword and shield, both bearing the same crimson device. They appeared battle-hardened, their expressions grim and wrathful. At their fore stood a priest in a brown robe, his hooded cowl cast in his face in shadow. What little I could see of his face was twisted into a menacing delight, as though he relished the fear he inspired and whatever act he intended to commit. I dropped the sack at once and fell to my knees, pleading for mercy as they advanced towards me, swords raised and ready to strike. It was then that I noticed, upon the far side of the tower wall, another opening, the mouth of a narrow stone stair spiralling upward. Scrambling to my feet, I fled for it and began to climb, desperate to escape their grasp. The stair rose steeply within the tower, and as I ascended, I felt my strength ebbing on the worn stone steps. Behind me came the unmistakable clank of armour, echoing horribly within the confined space as they followed, drawing closer with every step. "Well, officer, I really don't have much more to add regarding this poor fellow," said the Reverend Forester quietly. "He was, as you know, the gentleman in charge of the railway line they have recently opened. He convinced himself, largely from the newspapers, that some manner of curse was at work." The constable opened a leather attaché case and removed several papers. "We found these at the foot of the church tower, Reverend. I believe they are yours, judging by the covering letter attached?" "Yes," Forrester replied after a moment. "I lent him those research notes and I gave him the keys as well." "Quite. It would be best if we return them to you later. There's still rather a mess at the base of the tower where he fell." The Reverend sat in stunned silence, his thoughts turning unbidden to what little might remain of the man. "You say it will be clear by this evening?" he asked at last. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. "Council labourers are seeing to it now, and the body has been taken to the mortuary. So, to be clear, he was concerned about the alleged curse and the deaths, but he appeared in good spirits when you lent him the keys to view the carvings in the bell tower." "Yes," Forrester said softly. "That is the sum of it. Why he should choose to leap from the tower is quite beyond my understanding. I imagine it was guilt over the lives lost during the railway's construction." He paused, then added, "But I am a humble man of God, not a psychiatrist." The constable gathered his papers and moved toward the door, then hesitated. "Oh, one more thing. We found an oak settle in the bell tower. It had been pulled away from the wall. Any idea why that might be?" Forrester looked up, puzzled. "None at all. It is normally kept against the tower wall for the bell ringers to rest. There is nothing of interest there." "I see," the officer said mildly. "Very well. There will be a coroner's inquest, of course. An officer will call tomorrow, if that suits you, to take a formal statement." With a reassuring smile, he took his leave. The end.